Welcome to the Holistic Health Bites podcast. I'm your host, Andrea Nicholson, crime scene investigator turned metabolic health investigator. This podcast provides bite-sized episodes to help you have a pristine health scene so you can live a vibrant, adventure-filled life. Let's dive in. Hello, and welcome back to the Holistic Health Bites podcast. Today, we are talking about statins, and specifically an article that was just published discussing the use of statins for those with high LDL or bad cholesterol when they're on a low carbohydrate diet. Now, this was published in the journal Current Opinion in Endocrinology, Diabetes, and Obesity by David Diamond, Ben Bikman, and Paul Mason. One of the main concerns people and many medical professionals have about low-carb and ketogenic diets is that they sometimes cause a rise in LDL cholesterol readings on blood work. There's been a lot of research on the benefits of low-carb diet for weight loss and management of type 2 diabetes, but there's this fear around cardiovascular disease that has been lingering for decades. Fear of consumption of fat, specifically saturated fat, has lived on for over 50 years, despite there being no conclusive evidence that healthy fat consumption is causal of heart disease development. These claims are somewhat drawn from the diet heart hypothesis, which holds the view that LDL cholesterol is a principal driving force in the development of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, and that the key initiating event in atherogenesis is the retention of LDL cholesterol within the artery wall. Now, LDL is seen as the villain that must be lowered to reduce the risk of heart disease, hence why statins are so highly recommended for their LDL lowering capabilities. Numerous studies and reviews have been done over many decades, highlighting significant critiques of the original diet heart hypothesis and the data collection used to draw the hypothesis conclusions. So what do we know and what do we not yet know? That is what this article is discussing. Low-carb diets have been shown to improve several markers of cardiovascular disease. It is not yet fully determined if simply increasing LDL-C is atherogenic, neutral, or even beneficial. There are no long-term studies evaluating the impact of increased LDL-C with low-carb diets to show whether there's benefit or risk. Three main factors these authors looked into in the research and the medical industry. One, is LDL-C a causal factor in cardiovascular disease? Two, what role does insulin resistance and various lipid profiles have on cardiovascular disease? And three, what does a low carbohydrate do to cardiovascular disease risks? So let's start with number one, LDL-C as a causal factor in cardiovascular disease. This belief stems from research done mostly prior to 1985 on people with familial hypercholesterolemia, which is a genetic condition causing premature cardiovascular disease due to impaired binding of the LDL to the cell receptor, which leaves more LDL in the blood. This information was then extrapolated to the entire population, stating that elevations in LDL-C must also cause the development of cardiovascular disease. But this also brings up several inconsistencies in the theory. If elevated LDL-C were the only factor, then the risks should increase with larger elevations and with longer exposure. So if a person has high LDL-C for many, many years, this should increase their risk. But those with familial hypercholesterolemia, or FH, their risk actually decreases with time. Elderly people with FH after decades of elevated LDL-C have no increased rate of cardiovascular disease and no increased risk of ischemic stroke either when compared to those without FH. So how can LDL-C be the causal factor if that's true? And if you take it one step further, those with FH have an all-cause mortality equal to or lower than the general population. This article posits three theories on why those with FH aren't all dying young from cardiovascular disease. Number one, a small subset of those with FH do die prematurely, but these people all seem to be genetically more susceptible to coagulopathy, independent of their LDL status. This condition alters the blood's ability to clot, increasing the risk of bleeding. This is what's actually causing the early death in those with FH. Number two, LDL-C is important for the immune system. It actually helps lower mortality from cancer and infections. And we know infections can contribute to the development of atherosclerosis. And number three, those with FH tend to have relatively low rates of type 2 diabetes, which is a significant risk factor for cardiovascular disease. Also interesting is that those in the general population without FH also tend to have greater longevity with higher LDL-C compared to those with lower LDL-C. Multiple heart disease organizations hold strong to the belief that LDL-C is a cause of cardiovascular disease, despite it being repeatedly found to be a poor marker of cardiovascular disease risk and mortality, including all-cause mortality. Calcification within the coronary arteries has been found to be a reliable risk marker. Coronary arterial calcium scoring, or CAC scoring, has been shown to be the best predictor of fatal and non-fatal coronary events in diabetics and non-diabetic individuals, and in people of all ages. Studies have shown that over 1/3 of people with very high LDL-C have a 0 CAC score, showing very low risk of future coronary events. Other tests have been found to be better correlated with cardiovascular disease risk are elevated fasting glucose, elevated hemoglobin A1C, and elevated triglycerides. Another overlooked feature of LDL-C are the different types of LDL particles. Total LDL-C represents the sum population of all of the different LDL particles, including a marker called Lp(a), which is related to increased risk of cardiovascular disease and a pro-inflammatory state. Now, the second major category of information that this article looked at was the relevance of insulin resistance and various lipid profiles in cardiovascular disease. Current research has clearly demonstrated that insulin resistance is a strong and independent risk factor for hypertension and cardiovascular disease and has a major causal influence on the development of cardiovascular disease. Insulin resistance drives the development of type 2 diabetes, which is the greatest risk factor for cardiovascular disease. Insulin resistance is related to hypertension, increased blood clotting, advanced glycation end product associated endothelial dysfunction, which is just a fancy way of saying that there's sugar molecules being attached to various cellular components, which cause damage and kind of make everything sticky, and impaired nitric oxide synthesis, which is directly related to blood vessel dilation, hormone release, neurotransmitter function, and a lot of different cell signaling processes. All of these contribute to blood vessel damage and impaired function. Insulin resistance, as it relates to hypertension, causes the kidneys to retain more sodium, and it also activates the sympathetic nervous system, which is our fight or flight reaction. Chronically elevated insulin, as seen with insulin resistance, chronically elevates epinephrine, which activates the cardiovascular system, increases the amount of blood pumped through the heart, and increases platelet aggregation. Insulin resistance with elevated insulin levels also causes increased foam cells to be formed, which are a chief component of plaques. These foam cells are created by immune cells called macrophages that gobble up many things that we don't want in our bodies. That also includes lipids. When they become overloaded with the lipids, they become foam cells. They actually die and look kind of foamy. This initiates a pro-inflammatory cascade that ends up burying the foam cells inside the arterial walls. Insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, and obesity are associated with more dangerous types of LDL. So earlier I mentioned that there's different LDL particle sizes. They range from small, dense LDL to large, fluffy, buoyant LDL particles. The small, dense LDL more easily undergo atherogenic modifications, including glycation, which increases inflammation, glucose levels, and overall cardiovascular disease risk. This makes up one part of the atherogenic dyslipidemia triad, which includes elevated triglycerides, small, dense LDL, and low HDLC. Each piece of this triad increases the risks individually and even more so when combined. This triad has been referred to as pattern B in many other publications. So if you see that, that is what this is referring to, is the more dangerous pattern of lipids. This pattern B shows a threefold increased risk of myocardial infarction independent of age, sex, and relative weight. Large buoyant LDL has not been shown to be an increased risk for cardiovascular disease. The Framingham Offspring study, published in 1992, showed that low HDL, or the good cholesterol, along with elevated triglycerides, were correlated with lower levels of large buoyant LDL, higher small dense LDL, and increased risk of coronary artery disease. One simple way you can evaluate your pattern is to look at the triglyceride to HDL ratio. Now, this can be calculated on any standard lipid panel, even if the lab didn't report it. Simply divide your triglyceride value by your HDL value. An elevated ratio is predictive of this riskier pattern B profile. Ideally, this number should be as low as possible, at least under 2. For example, if you have a triglyceride value of 150 and an HDL value of 30, you would have a ratio of 5. This would be increased risk. Instead, if you had a triglyceride level of 70 and an HDL level of 65, you would have a ratio of 1.07, which is low risk. And the last section of this article discusses low carbohydrate diets as they relate to cardiovascular disease. So we've already established that insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, and metabolic syndrome conditions increase cardiovascular disease risk. The great news is even modest nutritional changes can often be far more effective than pharmaceuticals for reducing cardiovascular disease risk. Low-carb diets have been shown to decrease risk factors such as visceral fat, which is the fat around your organs, blood pressure, levels of Lp(a), or the bad kind of LDL that is pro-inflammatory, and inflammation, as well as glucose, lipids, and other insulin-based risk factors. One study compared a low-carb diet to a low-fat diet in obese adults and showed that the low-carb diet lost more weight, increased HDL-C, decreased triglycerides, and decreased C-reactive protein, which is a marker of inflammation, more than the low-fat diet did. Meta-analyses of several other studies have shown the same improved results with low-carb over low-fat. Several longer-term studies from 6 months to 3 years have shown reductions in several risk factors, such as lowering triglycerides, lowering small dense LDL, balancing blood pressure, and reducing hypertension medications using a ketogenic diet, which is, by its very nature, low carbohydrate. One 2-year low-carb intervention study also showed improved carotid intima media thickness, which is basically a measure of the thickness of the arterial wall. Several long-term ketogenic studies have been done on patients with epilepsy, showing the safety of these nutritional interventions for long term. One study was even 10 years long. Add in numerous practitioners, doctors, nutritionists, and dietitians who have used and recommended low-carb and ketogenic diets for their clients for many years without increased risk of cardiovascular disease events, and there's a mountain of data showing the benefits. When it comes to the fear around saturated fat and increased risk of cardiovascular disease, one randomized clinical controlled trial by Volek et al. Showed that the low carb group had superior improvement of cardiovascular disease risk factors compared to the low fat group, despite consuming 3 times more saturated fat. While LDL-C may increase with low carb diets, the particle size also increases, leading to more of the large buoyant LDL and therefore lower cardiovascular disease risk. There is extensive evidence that carb reduction can improve elevated glucose, insulin resistance, inflammation, hypertension, body weight, and the atherogenic triad. There are currently no published clinical trials that evaluate individuals on a low-carb diet who also have elevated LDL-C with or without statin treatment. However, there are 2 statin studies that can be helpful in assessing the risks and benefits. The first was a reanalysis of the data from the 4S trial, which was a study that evaluated secondary cardiovascular disease prevention for those who have a history of angina or myocardial infarction, as well as having elevated LDL-C. All participants from the study were assessed for additional coronary events in either the placebo or statin-treated groups with either an atherogenic profile or a non-atherogenic profile with respect to HDL levels and triglyceride levels. When looking at just the placebo group, those that had the non-atherogenic profile or low triglycerides with high HDL had lower incidences of coronary events than those in the placebo group than those who had the atherogenic profile, low HDL and high triglycerides. Remember, both groups had high LDL-C. This would suggest that the atherogenic profile is a stronger predictor of cardiovascular disease risks. When looking at the statin-treated groups, the statin reduced coronary events only in the population that had the atherogenic profile of high triglycerides and low HDL. The statin had no benefit on the non-atherogenic group that had high HDL and low triglycerides. So this would suggest that individuals who follow a low-carb diet that often results in the non-atherogenic profile type would not likely benefit from a statin. The second study was the prospective study of pravastatin in the elderly at risk, or the PROSPER study. This evaluated elderly men with pre-existing vascular disease or who were at increased risk due to diabetes, hypertension, and or they were smokers. The men were randomized into either the pravastatin group or the placebo group and then followed for coronary events over the next 3 years. When looking at the placebo group, those that had low HDL, consistent with insulin resistance and the atherogenic profile, developed significantly greater incidence of coronary events compared to those in the placebo group who had high HDL-C. When looking at the statin-treated group, the benefits again were only found in those with low HDL, independent of the LDL-C. Those that benefited the greatest were those that had the lowest HDL. Statins, like all other medications, come with additional risks. They increase the likelihood of developing type 2 diabetes, increase fasting blood glucose in those with and without diabetes, contribute to metabolic dysfunction, increased risks of tendinopathy and myopathy and acute kidney damage, and even cognitive impairment. If a low-carb diet creates a non-atherogenic profile, which reduces the cardiovascular disease risk significantly, this seems to be the most natural way to reduce the risk without causing negative side effects. Like any other nutrition or lifestyle program, it's always advised to work with a highly trained healthcare practitioner to ensure monitoring and proper application. Unfortunately, a lot of what you'll see on social media is not a healthy way to apply a lower carbohydrate plan and will actually increase your risks rather than decrease your risks. If you want to evaluate your risks and get started on a true heart-healthy plan, schedule a free consultation with me to discuss your unique situation. I'll leave a link in the description of this episode. Until the next, be well and vibrant. Thanks for being a faithful listener to the podcast. I'd love it if you left me a 5-star review on this podcast so that others can more easily find this valuable information. Did you know I also work one-on-one with clients? I approach solving health challenges like I approached solving crimes, by conducting a thorough investigation into your case. Sadly, hundreds of millions of people in the US have insulin resistance, prediabetes, and diabetes, and the vast majority have no idea. I'm here to fix that. If you struggle with low energy, stubborn weight, hypertension, sleep disturbances, or any other undesired symptoms, let's talk. All you have to do is schedule a free call. The link will be in the show notes. And no, you do not need to live near me.